The snow was getting into my collar. I don't know how long I had been sitting on the concrete steps outside the building, but long enough for the cold to stop being painful and start being almost comfortable, which I had heard somewhere was a bad sign. My coat, a thin charcoal peacoat I'd bought on clearance 2 winters ago, back when Elises and I were still playing house, was doing absolutely nothing against the January night. I could feel the wet seeping through the back of my jeans, and somewhere behind my knees there was a numbness that should have made me stand up and go inside. It didn't. My phone was still in my hand. The screen had gone dark, but I hadn't locked it. If I pressed the button, it would show me the message again, and I already had every word of it memorized so completely that it might as well have been tattooed to the inside of my skull. Thought you should hear it from me first before the announcement goes up. Marcus and I are engaged. I know things ended roughly between us, Clara, but I genuinely hope you find someone who can give you what you need. You always needed more than I could offer. She had said that. More than I could offer. As if she had ever offered anything. As if 2.5 years of me making myself smaller and quieter and less inconvenient had somehow been a burden on her. As if I was the one who had taken too much. I pressed the button, read it again, put the phone face down on my thigh. The city was quiet at this hour. The apartment building behind me was a converted Victorian in the kind of neighborhood that was halfway between charming and forgotten. The kind of place where the heating was unreliable, and the pipes made sounds at 3 a.m, and the buzzer on the main door hadn't worked in 6 months, so everyone just left it unlocked and hoped for the best. I had moved here in October, after the breakup, after the lease I'd been paying alone for 3 months finally became impossible. I had exactly 2 boxes of books, 1 mattress, a second-hand drafting table, and the private, fierce determination to not let anyone see how badly I was falling apart. I had been doing a reasonable job of that, until tonight. The snow wasn't heavy, just that quiet, persistent kind that seems more like atmosphere than weather. It settled on my forearm without urgency. It gathered in the folds of my sleeves. I watched a flake land on the back of my hand and dissolve, and I thought, that's probably what I've been doing for the last 2 years. Landing somewhere warm and disappearing. I didn't mean to start crying again. I had already cried so much that evening that I genuinely thought I had run out. But apparently grief is renewable, because it came back in one long, silent wave that bent me forward over my knees and squeezed the air out of my chest, and I sat there on the steps of my new building in the snow, heaving quietly, alone in the cold, in January, at 29 years old, and thought with perfect clarity. I have no one to call. My mother was in Phoenix. We weren't close. Sienna, my old coworker from the bookstore, the only person from my old life who still texted me, was on a flight to Edinburgh to visit her girlfriend. My new coworkers at the shop were friendly, but not that kind of friendly yet. And everyone else I had thought of as mine had turned out to be Elise's, which I should have seen coming, but had been too busy being in love to notice. So I sat in the snow with no coat thick enough and no one to call, and I let myself be exactly as pathetic as I actually was. You're going to die, the voice was cold. Not cold like the weather. Cold like a door that has been locked for a long time and isn't planning to open. I lifted my head and found a woman standing 3 feet away on the front path, a takeout bag in one hand and her keys in the other, staring at me with an expression so flat and unimpressed it almost made me forget I was crying. I had seen her before. You couldn't live in this building for 3 months without becoming aware of Rhea Calder in the same way you became aware of structural issues. As a fact about the building, not a thing you could do anything about. She lived in the apartment directly next to mine. I had heard her through the wall, not arguments, not music, just footsteps, and occasionally the sound of something being sanded or polished at hours most people reserved for sleeping. The other tenants talked about her the way people talk about difficult weather, with a combination of complaint and resigned acceptance. She had reported Mr. Desai in 4B for noise violations twice. She had refused to attend both the October potluck and the Christmas party. She had once, according to Mrs. Bellamy on the ground floor, stood in the lobby and watched a man struggle with a broken umbrella for 3 full minutes before informing him flatly that the stick was bent and he was making it worse. She was, by building consensus, someone you did not bother. She was standing in front of me right now, her dark coat still buttoned, her dark hair completely unbothered by the snow, looking at me like I was an inconvenience that had been placed specifically in her path. "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded like wet newspaper. "You're sitting in the snow in a coat that wouldn't keep a sparrow warm," she said. "You've been outside for at least 40 minutes. I saw you from my window when I left." She glanced at the phone on my thigh. "You didn't go anywhere. You just sat there." She had watched me. I didn't know how to feel about that. "I needed air," I said. "There is air inside. I needed cold air. You've had enough of that." She set the takeout bag down on the step above me, and before I understood what she was doing, she had unbuttoned her coat, a proper winter coat, heavy wool, charcoal, and bone, and dropped it around my shoulders. The warmth of her body was still in it. I flinched slightly at the weight of it, and then I sat very still, because the warmth was so sudden and so total that something in my chest cracked. I did not want to cry again in front of this woman. I had 3 inches of dignity left, and I wanted to keep them. "I don't need your coat," I said. "Correct," she said, picking up the takeout bag. "You need to go inside." "Come." She turned toward the door. I didn't move. Not from stubbornness, not exactly. I think I genuinely wasn't sure my legs would cooperate. She looked back. Something crossed her face, brief, controlled, quickly smoothed over, and she said, "Can you stand?" It was not a question. It was a quiet, practical assessment. "Yes," I said, and then I stood and proved it, though I swayed slightly and had to grab the railing. My hands were so cold I could barely feel the metal. She watched me without comment. When I had steadied myself, she simply turned and opened the door, and I followed her inside, wearing her coat, because I had no better options, and because some small irrational part of me did not want to be alone anymore tonight. Not even with someone who made it very clear she did not do soft. Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. Her apartment was the mirror image of mine. Same layout, same old floors, same 2 high ceilings, and completely different in every way that mattered. Mine was the visual evidence of someone who had unpacked survival, but not comfort. Canvases leaning against walls, sketches pinned crookedly, a drafting table crowded with half-finished pages, and dried-up pens, and the specific chaos of someone who keeps starting things and stopping them. Hers was ordered. Not in a sterile way, not like a hotel room, but in the way of someone who had decided very deliberately what would be in the space, and had allowed nothing else. Dark wood furniture, a reading lamp with a warm amber shade. Books on shelves arranged by size and color. On the work table near the far wall, several objects in various states of repair. A chair leg wrapped in cloth. A small oil painting propped on a foam block. A jar of something amber and chemical smelling. She did not give me a tour. She set the takeout bag on the kitchen counter, disappeared briefly, and came back with a folded set of clothes, plain dark tracksuit, socks, and set them on the table. "Bathroom is through there," she said. "Change out of what you're wearing. I'll make tea." I wanted to say that I was fine, that she didn't need to do this, that I could just go next door. But when I looked at my hands, I could see that my fingers were mottled pink and white, and the wet from the steps had soaked through my jeans completely, and I was shaking with the specific, irregular trembling of someone who has cried a great deal and stood up too fast in the cold. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." She didn't respond. I went to the bathroom. The tracksuit was a little large on me. She had a few inches and a broader shoulder, but warm. I caught my reflection in the mirror and looked at myself with honest appraisal. Puffy eyes, chapped lips, hair flattened by snow. I looked exactly like someone who had sat outside in January and cried about an ex-girlfriend until a stranger intervened. I washed my face with cold water and avoided my own eyes on the way out. She had made tea. 2 mugs, plain white ceramic, on the low table in front of the couch. She was seated in the armchair across from it. Not on the couch, where I would presumably sit, but in the chair with the precise arrangement of someone who had designated zones in her own living space and maintained them. I sat on the couch, pulled the blanket she had apparently also left there around my shoulders, picked up the mug, and felt the warmth travel up through my palms and into my arms, and said nothing for a full minute. She also said nothing. She sat with her own tea, her long fingers wrapped around the ceramic, and watched the middle distance with the patience of someone accustomed to silence. I should have left it there. I should have drunk the tea and said thank you and gone to bed, and been embarrassed about this tomorrow in a controlled and private way. Instead, I said she got engaged. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because Rhea Calder had watched me sit in the snow for 40 minutes and had come and put her coat around me anyway. And that meant she already knew something was wrong, and I was so tired of pretending nothing was. Rhea turned her head. To whom? To a man, I said, which is I don't know. She's been with men before. We were together for 2.5 years. I knew about the men. She said they didn't mean anything, and then apparently one of them meant enough. I stopped. The tea was chamomile. It was exactly the right thing. She sent me a message tonight. She said she hoped I'd find someone who could give me what I need. My voice was steady, almost clinical. I had apparently used up the crying portion of the evening. She said I always needed more than she could offer, as if I was the needy one. Rhea said nothing for a moment. Then, how long have you been separated? 3 months, since October. That's when I moved here, and she is engaged now. In January, 3 months, I said. So. I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. The math was obvious, and the math was cruel. Rhea looked at me. Her eyes were dark gray, not brown, not blue, exactly that ambiguous deep color that changes with the light, and she looked at me with a steadiness that was neither pity nor dismissal. It was more like the look of someone taking an accurate inventory. She wants you to feel like this, she said finally. She sent that message so that you would. I blinked. You don't know that. She could have said nothing. She chose to send it. She picked up her tea. People who want to be kind say nothing. People who want to be seen say they hope you're well. I stared at her. I paused. That's probably the most direct thing anyone has said to me about this. You don't need me to be comforting. You need to stop freezing yourself. You are, though, I said, comforting, in a completely terrifying way. Something happened at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, very briefly, like a draft under a door. Drink the tea, she said. I drank the tea. We sat in silence for a while, and the silence was, somehow, the least alone I had felt in months. I fell asleep on her couch. I don't even remember the moment it happened. 1 second I was watching the amber lamp make a warm circle on the ceiling, and the next the light was different, and gray was coming through the curtains, and I was sideways under the blanket with a pillow under my head that I did not remember placing there. She had covered me while I slept. I lay there for a moment processing this, then carefully sat up and found the apartment empty. But the kitchen smelled of coffee, and there was a note on the counter, a plain index card, handwritten in small, precise letters that leaned very slightly to the right. Coffee in the pot. Bread in the toaster if you press the button. Your clothes are dry. Lock the door behind you if I'm not back. That was all. No hope you're okay. No feel better soon. Just practical, efficient kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. I made the coffee and pressed the button on the toaster and ate the toast standing in her kitchen, looking at the restored painting propped on the work table. It was a small landscape, 19th century at a guess, with a lake and bare winter trees and a thin line of pale light at the horizon. Someone had damaged the lower left corner. There was a dark stain there, and the paint had cracked along a line that cut through the ice at the edge of the lake. Rhea had been working on it. I could see where she had begun gently cleaning the surface, the difference between the treated and untreated sections obvious when you looked closely. She spent her days repairing broken things. I thought about that, on the way back to my apartment, wearing my own dried clothes, carrying the folded blanket to return. She was coming up the stairs as I stepped into the hall. She was in her work clothes now, close-fit dark trousers, a worn flannel shirt, her hair pulled back. She was carrying a bag of groceries, and she stopped when she saw me. You slept, she said. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't mean to. I was going to leave, and I just... You needed it, she said. She looked at the folded blanket in my hands. You don't have to return that. I wanted to. I held it out. Thank you for last night. You didn't have to do any of that. She took the blanket. Next time you want to freeze to death, she said, knock first. It was so dry, so entirely unexpectedly dry, that I laughed. It came out louder than I intended, startled out of me, and it echoed slightly in the old hallway, and I covered my mouth immediately out of shock that it had happened at all. Rhea watched me with that almost expression and said nothing, which somehow made it funnier. And then I was just standing in the hall laughing quietly at nothing. And it felt like the first time I had genuinely laughed in weeks. She walked past me toward her door. But before she opened it, she paused and said, without turning around, Clara, yes? Eat something today. Something real. She went inside. I went inside. I stood in my own apartment for a moment, looking at the chaos of unfinished sketches and unpacked emotion and thought, I want to tell you about the building I lived in, because it matters to this story. The building, which everyone on the block called the Calder, not after Rhea, though it sometimes seemed like it should have been, was 6 stories of Victorian red brick in a city that kept half-heartedly trying to modernize and kept failing at it in charming ways. The radiators knocked. The elevator was unreliable. The Christmas lights on the 4th floor landing had been up since 2019, and no one had ever taken them down because the ladder was in storage, and the storage was locked, and no one could find the key. Mrs. Bellamy on the ground floor knew everyone's business without seeming to surveil anyone, had lived here for 23 years, left cookies outside her door every Friday, and had once caught the building super in a lie the boiler repair and delivered the correction with such polite devastations that the man had apologized twice and refunded a month's rent. There was a young couple on the 2nd floor, a rotating cast of students on the 3rd, and the 4th floor was me and Rhea, and a quiet man called Doctor. Hess, who I had met once in the elevator, said something kind about my coat, and then immediately retreated and not appeared again for 2 weeks. Everyone to some degree gave Rhea Calder space. Not space the way you give a person space because you respect them, space the way you give something powerful and unpredictable space, like a current in a river. She was not, to be clear, unkind. I want to be accurate about this. She never raised her voice. She never said anything personally cruel. She was simply impenetrable. She did not participate. She refused every invitation, not with excuses, but with silence, which people found more insulting. She walked through the building like she was moving through air that belonged to her, without apology, without warmth, without the social performance most people do constantly without ever noticing. She did not say good morning on autopilot. She did not hold the elevator for someone running. She did not make small talk with the delivery man. But I started noticing things. I noticed that the ice on the front steps, genuinely dangerous, a slip-and-sue situation, was always treated with salt before I left in the morning, even on the coldest days when leaving the apartment felt like an act of aggression. No one talked about who was doing it. I watched one morning from my window and saw Rhea come out at 6:45 in the gray dark with a bag of ice melt and distribute it across the steps with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this regularly and would continue without expectation of acknowledgement. I noticed that Mrs. Bellamy's door, which had been slightly off its hinges for as long as I had lived there, was suddenly, one afternoon, fixed. It opened cleanly, the scraping sound was gone. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Bellamy, she said, with her particular brand of amusement, "Our Miss Calder left a note saying the hinge was creating a fire safety issue. I woke up the next morning and it was done." She paused over her tea. "She put a new lock on it too, which I did not ask for. But it's a better lock, so I'm keeping it." A pause. "She is a peculiar creature." Another pause, this one deliberate. The best ones usually are. I noticed the stray cat. It was a large, gray tabby that lived around the building's service entrance, one of those outdoor cats that had clearly been fending for itself long enough to develop opinions about people. It hissed at the students. It ignored the couple on the 2nd floor. It had once bitten the building super, which frankly I respected. But when I came home one bitter February evening and found it sitting on the step with a kind of territorial composure, I also found a small ceramic dish just inside the service entrance, full of good quality wet food. I did not see Rhea put it there. I did not need to. These were the things I was thinking about when I ran into her in the elevator on a Thursday afternoon. We both entered from the lobby. Her first, me a few seconds behind, and she did not hold the door, but she did not pretend I hadn't made it in either. She pressed 4. I pressed 4. We looked at the same number, and she did not comment on this. The elevator was very small and very slow. It made a sound on the second floor, like it was reconsidering everything. We stood in silence. "How are the illustrations going?" she said. I stared at the door. "You know I do illustrations. You have a drafting table," she said. "I can hear you working sometimes, or I could before October." I felt something catch in my throat. "I've been blocked," I said. "Since the breakup, I used to illustrate for a children's publisher. I'm still doing it technically, but everything I make right now is wrong. The colors are wrong. The lines feel dishonest." I paused. "That probably sounds extremely dramatic." "It sounds accurate," she said. "If you're feeling something different than the work requires, the work resists." "Do you feel that?" I asked. "With what you restore?" The elevator stopped at 4, and we both stepped out. She considered the question in the hallway, keys in hand, with the air of someone who had not been asked about their work in a long while. "Sometimes," she said, "when something has been damaged too much, you can see it. The repair shows. The best restorations are the ones where you cannot tell anything was ever broken." She looked at me steadily. "You just have to keep working until the current voice and the original are the same." She went into her apartment. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, and then went into mine and sat at the drafting table and picked up a pencil for the first time in 3 weeks. I drew a woman sitting in the snow. The weeks did what weeks do. They stacked. I started going to Rhea's apartment the way you start doing things that seem accidental and then turn out to have been quietly deliberate all along. It began with a cup of sugar, honestly. I was making something, and I had none, and I knocked on her door because she was right there, and I was halfway through the recipe. She gave me the sugar with an expression that said this was not a precedent she was endorsing. A week later, she knocked on my door with a book, a monograph on botanical illustration, 19th century, beautifully printed. She held it out without preamble. "I found this at the studio," she said. "I thought you might want it." "Thank you," I said. I was in paint-stained overalls and holding a mug and had clearly been crying lightly but productively at some point in the last hour and was not trying to hide it. She looked at me with that accurate inventory look and said, "Have you eaten dinner?" I was going to. "There's extra pasta." She had apparently already decided this was a statement rather than a question because she had already turned back toward her apartment. I followed her. These dinners became a thing. Not every night. She was not someone who did things every night. There was a regularity to her that was not quite routine, but was something like rhythm, and I was learning to recognize it. But often enough that by late February, I found myself cooking with one ear toward the hallway, listening for her knock. She introduced me to her studio on a Saturday when she mentioned, in the elevator, that she was going in to work on the painting, and I asked, on impulse, if I could come. She looked at me for a long moment. "It's not interesting," she said. "I would find it interesting." A pause. "Fine." Her studio was on the ground floor of a converted warehouse a few blocks from the building, a place she rented by the month, high windows, north-facing light, the perpetual smell of linseed oil and acetone and old wood. It was wonderful. It was like walking into the interior of her mind, ordered and purposeful and full of beautiful damaged things in various states of recovery. A Victorian cabinet with its veneers meticulously stripped back. A set of chairs with their joints reglued and clamped. The painting from her apartment had been moved here. Now nearly finished, the damaged corner barely visible if you didn't know where to look. I sat at a clear section of the work table while she worked, and I sketched. I was working on new illustrations. Something was coming back, slowly, a particular quality of line I had lost in October, and she was working on a small jewelry box, with inlaid panels that had been shattered and painstakingly reassembled. We were quiet for 2 hours. It was one of the most companionable things I had experienced in years. At some point she said, without looking up, "What are you working on?" "A series," I said. "For a new project." "About a garden that grows under the snow without anyone knowing." She was quiet. "The protagonist is a child who finds it by accident," I said. "But the garden has a caretaker. A woman who tends it in secret." I paused. "I don't know what she looks like yet." Rhea said nothing, but her hands slowed on the jewelry box for a moment, then resumed. I kept drawing her, though I never said so. The freeze came properly in mid-February, one of those weeks when the city stops being picturesque and just becomes genuinely hostile. The cold of physical pressure, the snow grimy and institutional along the gutters. I got sick. Nothing dramatic, a chest cold, sore throat, the kind of illness that isn't bad enough to warrant actual rest, and so you try to push through it and make it 3 times worse. I worked my Tuesday shift at the bookstore and came home feeling scraped hollow and went to bed, still in my coat. I woke up at some point to the sound of a knock. I got the door. It was Rhea, in a sweater and dark jeans, holding a container of something that smelled of ginger and garlic. She looked at me, at my obvious pallor, my hollow eyes, my still-on coat, and said, with magnificent restraint, "You're an idiot." "I know," I said. "Go back to bed." I went back to bed. She made the soup. She brought it through in the bowl I pointed to when she asked, with a kind of efficient tenderness that did not pause to narrate itself. She sat in the chair by my bed while I ate it, not talking much, just present, occasionally checking with her eyes if the tea needed warming, doing the small practical things that meant, "You are not alone in this." At some point I said, "You don't have to stay." "I know," she said. "I mean it." "I know that too." She turned a page of the book she had brought with her. "You're feverish. You shouldn't be alone when you're feverish."
"How do you know I'm feverish?"
She reached over and pressed the back of her hand briefly to my forehead. The touch was quick, professional, a measurement. My skin went warm in a way that was probably not entirely fever-related. "You're warm," she said like a report. She stayed until I slept. She left the soup on my counter and a note on the same index cardstock she always used. "Drink all of it. I'll hear you knock through the wall if you need something." I pressed the note between the pages of the botanical illustration book. Here is the thing about Elise Monroe that I need you to understand before she reappears in this story. She was very, very good at being lovable. Not to everyone, not consistently. In private, she had a habit of turning small criticisms into large dissections, of making you feel that the thing you'd just said was slightly stupid, of making you feel that your needs were a quantity she was being asked to carry unfairly. But she was charming in public, generous with compliments when others were watching. And she had a talent for making you feel, after a difficult evening, that the difficulty had somehow been yours. I spent 2.5 years in a gentle fog of believing that I was the problem. That I was too emotional, too slow to move on from things, too attached to my work, too particular about details that didn't matter. That the reason I always felt subtly sad was a deficiency in me, not a response to being with someone who treated my feelings as weather, inconvenient and impermanent. I had not fully understood any of this until I met Rhea, not because Rhea told me. She never once said anything critical about Elise, even when I gave her every opening. She simply was different. She was honest about when she was tired or when she didn't want to talk. She said what she thought, without making it a verdict on what I thought. When I made a joke she didn't find funny, she did not pretend otherwise, but she also did not make me feel stupid for having made it. When I said something she found interesting, her eyes changed in a way that was purely involuntary, and that involuntary quality, the realness of it, made me understand, slowly, that I had spent years with someone who performed interest while being somewhere else entirely. By the end of February, I was working again. Not just technically working, but genuinely. The illustrations had a quality I hadn't had before, warmer and more specific, with a texture that my editor called newly brave. I was sketching the Snow Garden series in the evenings, working on the caretaker, her long-fingered hands and controlled expression, and the way she moved through rows of things she had kept alive through the winter without anyone seeing. I had also, without quite deciding to, started falling in love with the woman next door. I want to tell you exactly when I knew. It was a Thursday in late February. I was working the morning shift at Marginal Notes, the bookstore. A small, wonderful place that had too many books and not enough room and exactly the right number of cats on the windowsills. I was shelving in the back room when I heard the bell above the door and did not look up until Sienna, back from Edinburgh, newly radiant with the particular glow of someone who has been thoroughly loved in a European city, grabbed my arm and said, "Clara." "Clara, who is that?" I looked up. Rhea was standing at the front of the store. She was in her good coat, the one she had put around my shoulders in the snow, and she was looking at the display shelf near the door with that focused stillness she brought to everything. She had a small piece of paper in one hand, a list, I realized, and was comparing it to the spines on the display. She had come to the bookstore. She hadn't told me she was going to. "That's my neighbor," I said. Sienna looked at me, then at Rhea, then back at me with the particular expression of someone rapidly assembling new information. "That's the one you've been talking about." "I haven't. For 2 months," Sienna said. "You have mentioned this woman on no fewer than 7 occasions across 4 different conversations. You mentioned her hands last week." A pause. "Her hands, Clara." "I was talking about her restoration work. You described her hands." Sienna released my arm with the satisfied look of someone who has proven a point. "I'm going to go introduce myself. Please don't." But Sienna had already moved toward the front. I watched with genuine alarm as she greeted Rhea with her particular brand of confident friendliness and said something I couldn't hear. Rhea looked at her, looked back at the list, said something brief. Sienna pointed toward the back where I was standing, and Rhea looked up and found me, and something crossed her face that I could not categorize. She walked over. "You work here," she said. "You knew that," I said. "I knew the bookstore," she said. "Not specifically here." She looked at the shelves. "I need something for Mrs. Bellamy." She mentioned a history of the neighborhood written in the 70s. I told her I'd look. Of course she had. "I know exactly the one," I said. "Follow me." We moved through the stacks together, and it was the most normal thing. Her looking over my shoulder at the shelves, me pulling a book here or there to check a spine, the domestic ease of it, until I found the right volume and handed it to her, and she opened it and read the first page with the private focused expression she had when something interested her. She was 2 feet away from me in a narrow aisle between the travel section and local history, and the light through the window was winter white and fell across her profile with a kind of absurd cinematic precision, and I thought, oh no, I was in enormous trouble. She bought the book for Mrs. Bellamy. She also bought 3 other things from her list, paid in cash, and said goodbye to Sienna with a nod that Sienna later described accurately as terrifyingly dignified. She turned to me at the door and said, "Are you finished at 5? 5:30, I said. "There's a winter market on Harrow Street. Walk there with me if you want." It was not precisely an invitation. It was more like a fact she was presenting for me to agree with. I agreed with it. The Harrow Street Market was the kind of thing that looked like a film set and tasted real. Mulled wine in paper cups, roasted chestnuts, a stall selling improbably good pierogi run by a woman who called everyone sweetheart with absolute sincerity. Rhea moved through it with her hands in her pockets, and I walked beside her, and we bought things and commented on things and watched people. And at one point, I put my hand on her arm because I was reaching past her for a sample of smoked cheese, and her whole body went still for a half second, and I pulled my hand back and said sorry, and she said, "It's fine," and looked away. We did not talk about that. On the walk home, the city was blue and cold and strung with lights still left up from Christmas, and she asked about the Snow Garden series, and I told her about the caretaker and the child, and what the garden was supposed to mean. She listened the way she listened to everything, fully, without performing it. "What does the garden grow?" she said. "Things that aren't supposed to grow in winter," I said. "Things that are supposed to be impossible. But the caretaker has kept them alive in secret for years." "Why secret?" she said. I looked at the pavement. Because she thought no one would believe her. Rhea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, or because she was afraid that if she showed anyone, they would leave, and the garden would stop being hers. I looked at her. She was looking at the street ahead. Yes, I said. Exactly that. We walked the last 2 blocks in silence, and when we reached the building, she held the door, and I went through, and we rode the elevator up to the 4th floor, and stood in the hallway outside our doors, and I said night, and she said good night, and we went inside, and I stood against my own closed door for a long time with my heart beating 4 times too fast. The crack appeared in March. I was coming home in the late afternoon when I heard it, a raised voice from the 2nd floor, the young couple in 2A in the middle of what was clearly a serious argument. I couldn't make out words, just the shape of anger, one voice rising and the other trying to bring it down. The rhythm of a fight that had been going on for longer than this particular afternoon. I kept walking, not wanting to be part of it, and then I turned the corner to the 4th floor landing and stopped. Rhea was standing very still against the wall just outside the elevator, her back to the plaster, her eyes closed. Her hands were pressed flat to the wall behind her, and she was breathing very slowly and deliberately, the kind of breathing that is a technique rather than a reflex. Her face was completely controlled, but her hands were shaking. I stopped. I didn't say anything. I just stood there. After a moment, her eyes opened. She looked at me. Something passed through her face that I had never seen there before. Embarrassment, almost. And something underneath it that was much older and more complicated. The voices from downstairs shifted and diminished. Rhea's breathing evened out. Sorry, she said. Don't apologize, I said. She pushed away from the wall, started toward her door. Rhea. She stopped but didn't turn around. I didn't know what to say. I knew that pushing was wrong. I knew that questions would close her up like a fist. So I said simply, I'm going to make tea. Do you want to come over? A silence. Yes, she said. We sat in my apartment. In the particular comfortable clutter of it, the canvases and sketches, the botanical book open on the table. The stray cat, who had apparently decided at some point that my windowsill was acceptable and now appeared there with a regularity that suggested a standing arrangement. And I made tea, and I let her be quiet for as long as she needed. After a while, she said, I don't do well with shouting. Okay, I said, She stopped. Started again. I grew up in a house where the volume was unpredictable. She said it, the way you say things that you have practiced saying without quite saying them. It's better now, most of the time, but sometimes it still catches. Okay, I said. I was not going to make her feel observed. She looked at the sketches pinned to my wall. At the ones for the Snow Garden series, the caretaker visible in 3 of them, a figure seen from the back, tall and long-haired, walking between rows of impossible winter flowers. She looked at them for a long time. The caretaker, she said finally. She looks like someone who has been alone a long time. She has, I said. But the child finds her. A pause. Then Rhea said very quietly, I used to be different. I waited. When I was younger, she said. I was not like this. I had a partner. For 5 years. She stopped. Something moved across her face. She was charming. She was warm in public. She was very good at making me feel necessary. She turned her mug in her hands. And then she took everything. Financially, practically, she took everything I had built. And she did it slowly enough that I convinced myself it was my choice, until it was over and there was nothing left. A pause. My family sided with her, because she was charming and I was. She gestured slightly at herself. People believe the warm one. I believe you, I said. She looked at me. You always say the simplest things. I mean it simply. She looked down at her tea. I decided it was easier to stop being necessary, to be the kind of person no one asks things of. That way no one can take what they're not given. That must have been so lonely, I said. She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. We sat in the comfortable wreck of my apartment for another hour, and she looked at my drawings, and I showed her the caretaker's hands, the ones I had been working on, the way they moved through the garden, and she looked at them for a long time without speaking. When she left, she paused at the door and said, without turning, The caretaker's hands look like mine. I know, I said. She went into her apartment. I sat down on the floor with my back against my own door, and I was shaking a little, not from cold, and I put my face in my hands and breathed. There was a night in mid-March when the weather couldn't make up its mind and turned everything to sleet. And the power went out in both our apartments around 9 in the evening. I heard her knock before I even found the candles. 3 precise knocks, her knock, the one I would recognize anywhere now. She was at my door with 2 candles already lit and a bottle of wine, and she said, without preamble, "My apartment is colder than yours. Your building side gets the south wall." "That is a completely practical reason to be here," I said. "Yes," she agreed and came inside. We sat on my floor with the candles between us and the wine poured into the closest things I had to glasses, which were actually 2 mismatched mugs, and we talked differently than we usually did. Something about the darkness made the space between us feel smaller, more honest. She told me more about her childhood, the unpredictable house, the way she had learned early that quiet was safer than want, and I told her about Elise, the real version, not the sanitized one I usually gave. The way I had spent years apologizing for having feelings. The way I had learned to preemptively make myself smaller so there'd be nothing for Elise to criticize. "You do that still," Rhea said, not unkindly, just as observation. "What? You apologize before anyone says anything is wrong." She looked at me in the candlelight. "You apologized for using too much tea the first morning. I had given you the tea. I opened my mouth, closed it. You don't have to do that here," she said. The candle between us guttered slightly. Her face in that light was different. Softer in the jaw, more open in the eyes, something she had been keeping contained moving closer to the surface. I was very aware of how close we were sitting. I was very aware of her hands around the mug. "Rhea," I said. "Don't," she said quietly, but it wasn't cold the way her don'ts used to be. It was frightened. "I'm not asking you for anything," I said. "I just want you to know that I see you, the way you see me." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sleet was hitting the windows in sheets. The candle threw everything in amber. "That's the problem," she said finally. "You see too clearly." We sat there until the power came back, and when it did, we both blinked in the sudden light. And she gathered her candles and her mug and went back to her apartment, and I sat on the floor in my lit room and pressed my fingers against the warmth the candles had left on the wood and did not sleep for a long time. April came with a particular cruelty. The snow started melting, which sounds like relief, but actually produces a kind of in-between sadness. Everything too wet and colorless. The beauty of the winter gone, and the beauty of spring not yet arrived. The city in the raw, underdressed state of a place caught between things. And into this between place, on a Tuesday afternoon when I was at the bookstore, came Elise. I saw her before she saw me. She was in the travel section, of course, always looking for the next departure, wearing the red coat she knew I loved, her dark hair shorter now. She looked exactly the same as she had, which was the cruelest thing she could have done. She turned and saw me. "Clara." Her voice was warm with the practiced warmth of someone who had decided before entering to be warm. "You look really well." "Thank you," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of it. "I've been thinking about you," she said, moving toward me with the confident ease of someone who has never considered they wouldn't be welcome. I felt terrible about the message. I should have called. "The engagement." She paused, looked at me with something calculated in her eyes. "It happened very fast. I think I got swept up. And then I thought about you and I." She reached out and touched my hand lightly. "I miss you, Clara. I miss what we had. The old version of me would have felt the pull of this. The old version of me would have taken the hand and the warmth and the suggestion of regret as an offering, as proof that I had mattered enough to be missed. The old version of me would have thought, maybe this time." I looked at her hand on mine. "What happened to Marcus?" I asked. She blinked. Something shifted behind her eyes. "We're still, it's complicated. Is he still your fiancé?" A pause. "We're talking through some things. Elise." I pulled my hand back. "You got engaged 3 months after we ended. You sent me a message at 11 at night to make sure I knew. And now you're here because..." I looked at her. "Why are you here?" "I told you. I miss you. You miss knowing I'll take you back." I said it very quietly, not with anger, just with precision. "You miss having someone you can return to. That's not the same thing. Her expression changed. The warmth became something cooler and more honest. You've changed, she said. I hope so, I said. Whoever you've met, she said, with a particular edge she reserved for when she had lost control of a conversation, or whatever you've convinced yourself you're feeling. Please go, I said. She went. She straightened her coat, and she walked out of the bookstore, and I watched the door close behind her. And then I sat down very slowly in the chair near the register because my legs were shaking slightly. Sienna appeared from behind a shelf with a cup of tea from the back. I've been holding this for 4 minutes, she said, preparing for any outcome. She's gone, I said. I know, I watched. She handed me the tea. Are you okay? Yes, I said. And I was surprised to realize I meant it entirely. What I didn't know was that Rhea had come by the bookstore at the end of my shift and had seen Elise through the window before coming in, had stood outside and recognized something about the scene, and had waited. She had watched me pull my hand back. She had watched Elise leave. She was at the counter when I came out, and I nearly walked into her, and she looked at me with a kind of controlled intensity I didn't immediately understand. She was here, she said. Yes, I studied her face. How long were you outside? Long enough. A pause. Are you... I'm okay, I said. I told her to leave. A beat. I meant it. Something in Rhea's expression shifted. Something released, very slightly, like a watch spring unwinding one careful click. Good, she said. Were you worried? I said, and I was smiling. I couldn't help it. I came to walk you home, she said, which was not an answer and was a better one. We walked home. It was a gray April evening, the beginning of the real thaw. Everything damp, and the air carrying for the first time the distant suggestion of things returning. She walked beside me, and our arms were close enough to brush, and I did not move away, and neither did she. On the front step, she paused. The stray cat was waiting with its usual scheduled composure, and she bent and fed it something from her pocket, with the unsentimental competence she brought to all caring, looking sideways as though to deny she was doing it. I watched her. The soft decline of her neck, the precision of her hands, the way she straightened and saw me watching, and for a moment did become the closed-off version of herself. Rhea, I said. What? Thank you, I said, for everything. Since January, I paused. You didn't have to be kind to me, and you were anyway, and it's meant everything. She looked at me for a long moment. I wasn't kind, she said. I was practical. You were kind, I said. You were kind, and you just called it practical because it was easier. The air between us had changed. Genuinely, the way the temperature shifts when a front moves through. And she was looking at me with the full weight of those gray eyes, and I was standing close enough to see the line of her jaw and the careful control of her expression and the thing underneath the control that she was working hard to keep contained. Clara, she began. Don't, I said, not harshly. Don't pull back. I can see you starting to. Her jaw tightened. I don't want to be your... She stopped. You have just gotten out of something painful. I am not. I know what I feel, I said. I'm not confused about her anymore. I'm not using you to heal from her. That's not what this is. I stepped closer. You know that. You can seize it. I know, she said. I know that. And then, for the first time, the control in her face cracked entirely, and what came through was something raw and entirely unguarded. That's the problem. You are the clearest thing I have seen in years, and She stopped, exhaled. I am afraid of wanting you too much. The words fell into the April air between us. I reached up and put my hand against her jaw, very gently. She went very still. Then want me, I said. I'm not going anywhere. She kissed me, or I kissed her. I genuinely cannot tell you which direction it went, only that it happened, that the last half-inch between us closed, and her hands were at my waist and mine were in her hair, and it was not tentative, it was not questioning, it was the kiss of two people who have been doing everything except this for 3 months, and have finally run out of reasons not to. She kissed me the way she did everything, with complete attention, with nothing held back, with the particular intensity of someone who has been careful for a long time, and is for this moment not being careful at all. And I kissed her back, and it tasted like everything I had wanted, since the night she wrapped her coat around my shoulders in the snow. When we came apart, we were both breathing harder then was perhaps dignified. Her forehead came down to rest against mine. My hands were shaking very slightly. Her hands at my waist were warm, an anchor. "Oh," I said. "Yes," she said. We stood there on the front steps with the cat watching us with magnificent indifference, and I began to laugh. Softly, this time, not the startled laugh from the hallway months ago, but something warmer and deeper. And after a moment she made a sound that was the closest I had heard her come to it, low and quiet and completely real. Then she pulled back. I felt it before she did it, the slight tension in her shoulders, the preparing. "Wait," I said. "Clara, I know you're scared," I said. "I know this is terrifying for you. I'm not asking you to not be scared." I looked at her. "I'm just asking you not to decide for me." A long silence. The city made its small city sounds around us. A taxi in the street. Somewhere a window opening. "I need a day," she said. "One day, too." She stopped. "One day." "Okay," I said. "Okay," she said. She went inside. I sat on the steps for a few minutes. Not crying this time. Just existing, breathing the beginning of spring air. And then I went inside too. The day she asked for was the worst day. I heard her through the wall in the morning, moving around her kitchen, the sound of her coffee maker, the particular footsteps I had learned, to recognize the way you learn the rhythm of someone's breathing when you've been close enough to hear it. I worked at my drafting table and did not knock. I went to the bookstore and came home and did not knock. I ate dinner standing over the counter, and I watched the wall and I waited. The knock, when it came, was at 10:30 at night. I opened the door. She was in her own doorway rather than mine, which meant she had knocked and then stepped back. Her hands were in her pockets and she was looking at me with the full, unguarded version of herself. No armor, no managed distance, just Rhea, standing in the hall at 10:30 at night, having spent a day deciding. "I am not easy to be with," she said. "I don't talk about everything I feel. I work late. I find most social situations exhausting. I have bad weeks where I go very quiet, and it is not about you, but it will feel like it is." A pause. "I have been alone for a long time, and I have forgotten how to be otherwise, and I will probably get it wrong in ways neither of us can predict." I waited. "But," she said, and the word had real weight, "I have spent every day since January thinking about you. I have thought about your hands when you draw, and the sound you make when you're working something out, and the way you talk to the cat, and the fact that you think I don't know you've been drawing me for 2 months." She paused. "I have wanted to be someone you could trust, and I was afraid that was the same as wanting you, but it is not. Wanting to be trusted is wanting to be worthy. Wanting you," she stopped, looked at her hands, then at me. "Wanting you is different. It is larger than that." I crossed into the hallway. I put both my hands on her face. She looked at me with those gray eyes, the whole weight of her in them. "I love you," I said. She closed her eyes. "I love you," she said, in a voice that sounded like something being put down after a very long time of carrying it. I pulled her toward me and kissed her in the hallway at 10:30 on an April night, and Mrs. Bellamy's door, which was on the same floor, opened about 6 inches and then closed again immediately, which we found out later she described to the second-floor couple as the most satisfying thing I have witnessed this decade. The building's spring gathering, which Mrs. Bellamy insisted on hosting as a spring equinox potluck on the grounds that seasonal fidelity mattered and January's leftovers of Christmas cheer were officially expired, happened on a Saturday evening in the lobby, transformed with a dedicated competence that spoke entirely to Mrs. Bellamy's organizational will. There were lights and a good tablecloth and an embarrassment of food from 6 different countries, and almost everyone in the building came down. And there was a particular moment, midway through the evening, where Rhea, who was standing at my side with her hand at the small of my back, and no explanation, offered. Accepted a small plate of something from Mr. Desai in 4B, the man she had noise complained twice, and said, very briefly but completely sincerely, that it looked good. Mr. Desai stared at her, then at me, then back at Rhea. Then he beamed with such absolute joy that his wife, coming up behind him with more food, asked what had happened, and she said it looked good. Mrs. Bellamy caught my eye from across the lobby and raised her glass of wine very slightly, and I raised my water glass back, and she smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had seen this coming since October. Elise did not come back after the bookstore. I heard later from a mutual acquaintance that the engagement had quietly ended and she had taken a job in another city, which I felt about with exactly the neutrality of someone who has moved on so completely that the old wound is a scar now, nothing that still bleeds. I want to tell you how it feels now. It is late May. The snow has been gone for weeks, and the city is doing what it does at this time of year, exhaling reluctantly into something warm and tentative. The windows are open and the air comes through, and the stray cat, whose name we have quietly agreed is Calculus, for reasons that felt right to both of us at 2 a.m. and which we have never questioned since, is asleep on the windowsill in a patch of sun, with the complete surrender of a creature who has found the best possible spot and intends to stay there. My illustrations are good again. They are better than they were before Elise, which I attribute to 2 months of being with someone who looks at my work, the way Rhea looks at things, with total attention, without flattery, with the honest and particular response of someone who sees you rather than the image you've constructed. My editor called the Snow Garden series exceptional and said the caretaker figure was the most compelling visual character I had ever created. I thanked her and hung up and turned to Rhea, who was at the table with coffee and the Sunday newspaper, and said she called the caretaker exceptional. Rhea looked up. "She is," she said, and went back to the paper. I sat down across from her with my own coffee and looked at the table. Her coffee, my coffee, the newspaper, my sketchbook open beside it, a piece of the jewelry box she had brought home because she wasn't finished with it yet. Calculus's food dish, the botanical illustration book with 3 of my bookmarks still in it. The ordinary, gorgeous archaeology of 2 people becoming a home. "You were going to sand that section today," as I said, looking at the jewelry box. "Later," she said. She folded the newspaper. "I was thinking we could walk to Harrow Street first. The market doesn't start until noon." "I know." She looked at me over the top of her coffee. "I thought we could get there before the crowds." She was not a crowds person. This was one of dozens of things I had learned. She was not a crowds person. She preferred reading to television. She had an inexplicable emotional investment in certain historical furniture periods. She made better pastry than she would ever admit. She slept on the right side of the bed. She woke early and did not make noise about it. She had a way of touching the side of my face when she was thinking about something else entirely, as though her hands had decided independently. "We could," I said. I was still smiling, I could feel it. "Or we could stay here." She looked at me. The expression she wore now, not oft in public, but here in the morning light of what was half her apartment and half mine and increasingly just ours, was the one I would paint if I could. Not the controlled version, not the managed distance, but the open one. The one that had been under everything all along, kept alive in secret, tended carefully in the dark, like flowers growing under the snow. "We could," she said. "Yes, outside the city was warming up." The light on the buildings was yellow and early. Somewhere on the street below a door opened and children were running and laughing, the loud, guileless laughter of people who have never had to be careful with their joy. I listened to them from the open window. I thought about the front steps, January, the cold concrete and the thin coat, and the phone in my hand and the snow getting into my hair. I thought about what I had believed that night, that I was the kind of person people leave, that my needs were a burden I should apologize for, that love was something I had to make myself small enough to deserve. I thought about a woman coming down the path with a takeout bag, her expression flat and unimpressed, wrapping her coat around someone she did not know because she could not walk past suffering and pretend otherwise. The cold woman next door who supposedly hated everyone, who fed the stray cat in secret and fixed the old woman's door without credit and put salt on the icy steps before dawn and kept beautiful damaged things alive in her studio with her long, careful hands. Who had told me once, looking at a painting she had nearly finished, the best restorations are the ones where you cannot tell anything was ever broken. Rhea's hand found mine across the table. I looked at her. She was watching me with the quiet, certain look she had when she was not going to say anything more because everything had already been said. I held her hand. Outside, the children were still running. The sun was getting warm. Somewhere in the courtyard, Calculus was probably finding a new patch of light, as cats do, relocating Joy with complete pragmatic confidence, leaving one warm place for a warmer one without apology. I was not crying in the snow anymore. I was here, I was warm, I was known, I had been found.